Welcome to the June 2017 update for the Microsoft Australia OEM team. In this month's update, we'll be covering a variety of topics related to Windows 10 deployment and some of the online and Windows Server pieces that integrate with that. So just to give a quick run through of the agenda, we'll start off with Windows 10s, which was recently announced. And one of the reasons why we're including this topic is we just finished a roadshow with one of our partners and we were getting a lot of questions on this. So we thought it would be worthwhile spending a little bit of time going through some of the capabilities, some of the things to expect with this, and some of the implications it has for Windows in the long term. Next up, we'll talk about some of the different Windows 10 deployment and management options. So these days we've got a lot more choices in terms of how we deploy Windows and how we manage it after it's been deployed. So in this section, we'll focus on these, and what we'll start doing here is having a little bit of a focus on some of the ways you can do this in education environments, but also a lot of these scenarios also apply much more broadly. So even though some of the technologies may say Windows education especially, bear in mind that a lot of the tools and technologies that we use in one situation apply just as equally or just as well in other scenarios as well. Then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the Windows Store because this has got important ramifications in terms of Windows 10s. Then again, we'll jump back into some of the school-focused content, so setting up school PCs app, just to give you an idea of some of the different ways Microsoft is targeting simplifying Windows 10 deployments without having to go through the whole rebuild your PC to load a new image on. The Windows Configuration Designer digs into that a little bit deeper. And then finally, we'll wrap up with Intune for Education before just covering off the resources that we normally talk about each month. So let's jump in now and kick off with Windows 10s. So taking a look at Windows 10s, some of the things that you'll notice here, first of all, without even looking at the items in the first column, is you'll see here that it stands alone as opposed to in between Windows 10 Home and Windows 10 Pro. Now, the way that I position this to people is that it's a subset of Windows 10 Pro, but it's not necessarily a superset of Windows 10 Home, in that it does offer some unique capabilities either way. So first up, if we take a look at this, the important things to note is that we can only add new apps that are coming down from the Windows Store. So this means that these have to be apps that have either been built from the ground up to run as Windows Store apps, or alternatively Windows Store apps that are repackaged versions of desktop apps. Now this is using a technology called Desktop Bridge, which allows application developers to go through, rewrap their traditional Win32 type apps and publish those up into the Windows Store so that you can deploy those out and start getting the benefits of simplified deployment, simplified management, etc. Through that store. And it all means things like simplified distribution for the content creator, and also for the user. It means that when it's time for updates, these will get pushed down through the regular Windows update process, as opposed to it being something that has to be managed separately. Now, as we come down to the next item, the domain join on-prem, now what you'll notice here is that this is something that Windows 10s does not support. So this is one of those things where I mentioned that it is a subset of Windows 10 Pro. Now the idea here is that it's really going to be used in scenarios from a management perspective where it's doing something like an Azure Active Directory domain join and then using some type of MDM solution such as Microsoft Intune to go through and perform the management tasks. So this is a very important thing to note here, in that, if someone says, well, look, we really need Windows 10 to join the domains, well, Windows Pro will do that. Windows 10 Pro will do that for you, obviously. But remember, you can always do a switch to Windows 10 Pro from Windows 10s at a nominal fee. So don't be too concerned thinking that you're stuck with Win 10s. It is something where you will be able to upgrade that to Pro if needed. As I mentioned, Windows Store apps are what Windows 10s does support. The default browser is Microsoft Edge with Windows 10s, and it's also important to note here is that you have to take into account the implications here, in that if you've got there are other browsers that you want to run, they'll need to be repackaged and distributed through the Windows Store. So that's an important point to note here, is if you do have a strong dependency on another browser, it may be something where you need to check with that vendor if they do have updated plans on supporting Microsoft Edge. Now, like Windows 10 Pro, it's got Windows Update for Business support. That means we've got more flexibility when it comes to managing the update cycle when we're using it alongside a management solution, in this case an MDM option, for example. We get Windows Store for business access, so we can have our own private library or curated store available to users. So we can just sort of make what we want available to those users available to make it easy for them to find alongside the existing Windows Store. Now, MDM support is included. We've got BitLocker support included. We've got the enterprise state roaming with Azure AD. So if you've got Azure AD premium subscriptions, that will work alongside Win10s the same way it works with Win10 Pro. And we've also got shared PC configuration. So for environments, and again, we'll talk about this from a school perspective, but it may apply in other work scenarios where you've got multiple people needing to jump on and off multiple devices during the day, sharing devices. A great way to be able to go through and either do like easier PC resets or have multiple profiles on the device without there being a performance penalty. Now, when we get to the final couple of items here, so in the other category, so Edge and Internet Explorer search defaults, Bing with designated regional search providers, well, Win10s is pretty much locked in, whereas with Win10 Home and Win10 Pro, as you already know, these are configurable. And as I mentioned, with Win10s and also with Win10 Pro, you can go through and do an in-place upgrade of that to Win10 Pro pretty easily. So I guess before we go on, probably just one final thing to talk about here is, some of the implications that this has for the long term and some of the improvements we'll see coming through from this to Windows in general. So first of all, by getting more and more apps into the Windows Store, it means that the Windows Store ecosystem will be healthier for all Windows users. But it also means that when we start talking about, well, what hardware will this version be compatible with? Well, there's no reason why it shouldn't run on the majority of of Windows 10 supported hardware that's out there. What you need to bear in mind, though, is if we take a look at that non-Windows Store applications requirement, what this means is that if you're installing device drivers, for example, that are coming through a setup.exe and have got a whole bunch of other applications that they pre-install, well, that's the kind of thing that Win10s is trying to move away from. So instead, it will just be a matter of using native drivers, hitting Windows Update. If you're building your own systems, using tools like drvinst to just sort of get the drivers you want on without all the associated utilities that normally come with drivers. So the end result here is you'll actually end up with something that's smaller, a smaller OS install, more lightweight, less things running that don't necessarily need to be running. So all up, I view this as something that's actually good direction for Windows, and it means that over time, as some of these benefits do carry on throughout the Windows ecosystem, we do see some pretty important changes. Now, some of the other things to take into account when it comes to Windows 10s is because of the way that it's configured and some of the work that Microsoft's doing to optimize it, they're talking about much higher battery life, for example, with it. They're talking about it being more secure, and also performing a bit better. So all up, it may be something that's worthwhile for some customer types. Now, this won't be shipping until the end of the year in the mass channel. There may be some devices that it becomes available on earlier than that. But remember, though, it's something where it will only appear on like a subset of OEM devices, because things like those device driver requirements, etc., the application requirements, are things that they've got to sort of go back to the drawing board in some cases and say, well, do we repackage these as Windows Store apps so that we can include them with the driver? Now, let's just take a look at some of the different ways that we can go through and do management and deployment of Windows 10. And in this case, again, I'll talk about school scenarios because that's one of the things that was covered a lot on one of our recent roadshows. And all I really want to do with this slide is give you an idea of, depending on the size of the organization, you can go through and have pretty basic group policy requirements with basic Active Directory. You could do cloud-based management. You can go through, and for larger organizations who've got server management requirements, who may have multiple server operating systems, this is where you still got Microsoft's tools like System Center Configuration Manager that can go through and do very broad device and operating system support there. So really, depending on your requirements, Microsoft does have a range of offerings. And the reason why I'm highlighting this is that sometimes we focus so much on what's new and what's improved that sometimes people start thinking, well, does that mean that I can't use the tools that I've been using in the past? So if you're using tools like Config Manager, or if you're using the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, if you're using Windows Deployment Services, these are all great solutions. So there's no reason to stop using those. It's just a matter of there may be other options that can provide different benefits in certain situations. And there's some of the ones that we'll talk about as we go through. Now, for those of you who have wanted a bit more of a chance to play around with tools like MDT and Config Manager and um, our Windows Deployment Server, for example, one of the recommendations I always make to people is to take a look and download the Windows 10 Deployment and Management Lab Kit. Now, I've got the URL up there, so let's just talk about what's included. So it includes the ability for you to go through and start building out Windows deployments in a pre-configured environment. Now in this case you'll see that it's got Config Manager included, it's got the Windows ADK, it's got MDT included, it's got other apps and services included though, and you'll see on the next slide is that it's not just around deployment but also management and testing out some of the different services that Windows 10 has to offer. So as much as sometimes we all have these grand ambitions of building out these great demo environments on top of Hyper-V, for example, so we can test a whole bunch of different scenarios out, by the time we start off thinking, well, do I need to deploy a domain controller? Okay, what domain name do I choose, etc. And we have to go through and build out the entire infrastructure. Well, sometimes that's great when we do want to learn about building out the infrastructure. But what if we just want an environment where this stuff works much more easily? And in this case, that's what the Windows 10 Deployment and Management Lab Kit does. So if we take a look at the next slide, here are the scenarios that it currently supports. Now these have grown over time, but things like creating new images, light touch using System Center, light touch using MDT, zero touch using System Center, Configuration Manager, scenarios around Windows information protection, code integrity, using provisioning packages, which we'll be talking about a little bit later in the recording, but also things like doing in-place upgrades. So something that Microsoft didn't really propose too heavily with earlier versions of Windows, but with Windows 10, Microsoft is definitely pushing hard to get organizations to do in-place upgrades because they're finding that it really speeds the process up and gives the user a better result afterwards. Now, other things you can test in there, the web app compatibility, if you need AppV, BitLocker, secure host services, Credential Guard, Windows Store for Business, which we'll talk about, as well as analyzing the upgrade readiness of the internal organization. These are just, these are the official labs that are included. But the thing is because you've got everything built to make this work, there's a whole ton of other scenarios you can start testing out here. So if I just go back one slide, for example, even just taking a look at the slides that are here, well, it's still talking about Windows 10 Enterprise 1607. So you might look at building out scenarios where you're taking it up to build 1703, for example. The ability to upgrade the version of Config Manager in there to the latest one, the version of the ADK to the latest one, for example, updating MDT to the latest version, as well as scenarios where you might go, but look, it's currently on Windows Server 2012 R2. Maybe I want to try introducing some Windows Server 2016 VMs. Now, what's good is that if you follow that link at the top, that will take you into the TechNet Evaluation Center, where you can download evaluation versions of Windows Server, Windows 10 Enterprise, etc. So that if you need to test out different scenarios, so again, Windows 10 Enterprise may offer different capabilities versus what you've offered in the past. That gives you a great way to test them out in a pre-configured environment and really get an idea of what value they provide. So let's keep going through now and spend a little bit of time talking about Intune for Education. So this is something that was just introduced, and the reason why we're covering it here is obviously it's got strong ties into Win10s, but also just into education customers in general. So one of the reasons why using Intune or an MDM solution is so popular with a lot of school organizations is they don't just have Windows devices, they've got iOS devices, they've got Android devices, and they don't want to go through and have these domains necessarily do a domain join, for example. Instead, these might be BYOD type scenarios. So these are student devices that the school wants to do some kind of light touch management on, but doesn't want to go down the path of applying hundreds of different group policy settings down to those devices. So if we take a look here, First of all, Intune for Education includes a subset of Azure AD Premium. So if you're familiar with Enterprise Mobility Suite, if you're familiar with Office 365, you're probably already familiar to a degree with Azure Active Directory, but there's also Azure Active Directory, well, there's a Premium 1 version, there's a Premium 2 version, and what you can see here is that the Intune for Education product actually includes those top items. So effectively, some of the things that are needed to make provisioning Windows easier in an online world are technologies that Intune for Education has included. So some of the single sign-on capabilities, auto-enrollment into the MDM solution. So you use your Azure AD credentials to sign into the device for the first time, and it will enroll in Intune and start having your MDM policies being applied. You've got enterprise state roaming, so effectively having your settings customizations following you from device to device. So your browser favorites, your browser history, your stored passwords, etc. All of these things are centrally stored inside of Azure AD storage. They're encrypted using Azure's rights management service, so they're stored in a very secure, controlled manner. Now, other capabilities, things like dynamic groups. So if you're familiar with Active Directory or Azure AD and being able to create queries that create dynamic groups, the ability to do cloud-based password changes and have those right back in on-prem. Now, as you keep going through that list, you'll see there are other capabilities that Azure AD Premium does provide that aren't included with Intune for Education, but in a lot of cases, those ones that start off with might be a good place to start, and then over time you may want to add additional features in. So even though this says school IT device management needs, in some cases, these are variations of scenarios we see inside of a lot of organizations, except I guess, some of the differences that we see in schools, things like the ratio of BYOD and the variety of operating systems. So, generally we're not seeing an organization that's standardized on one platform. Generally, we're seeing that they'll have iOS, they'll have Android, they'll have OS 10, as well as the different Windows versions. So some of the goals that Microsoft's got here with Intune for Education is to make it easier to go through and manage these across the board. So whether it's Win 10s, whether it's Win 10 Pro, Win 10 for Education, these are the different things that Microsoft wants to make easier to manage using the same infrastructure that you're using to manage those other platforms. So with Intune for Education, some of the top-line capabilities it introduces is being able to easily enroll new devices by simply joining Azure Active Directory. Easy deployment, so for smaller organizations that just want to do a smaller number of devices and just do device configuration with flash drives, for example, that's something that we can do with the Set Up a School PC app that we'll cover shortly. We've got zero-touch management, so once that device is enrolled, we can go through and start pushing new apps out. We can apply settings, etc. remotely, lock the system down if certain restrictions need to be applied. We make it easy for devices to be shared, so when one user signs out of a Windows 10 PC and the next user comes in, making sure that new user's settings come down quickly and very, very efficiently. Now, the Intune for Education console, it's built on top of Intune itself, and underneath it is full-blown Intune, but the design for education, so the Intune Education console, is really just about making it easy for people to do key things that may be important in an education scenario. Now, this does integrate with on-prem technology, so if you've got Azure AD Connect, if you've got ADFS, if you've got Config Manager, this all does integrate. And one of the changes that's been introduced here to really align better with the education market is that it's not just licensing Intune per user, which you would normally do, but you could also purchase it for the life cycle of the device inside of the organization as well. Now, for just some quick updates on Intune for those of you who have used Windows management through Microsoft Intune previously, then good news here is that the Silverlight portal is being retired, so that now we can use non-legacy browsers basically, so we can start using Edge and other browsers to do the management inside of that simplified console. Now, if we take a quick look at some of the additional things that Intune includes that Intune for Education doesn't, well, first of all, when we see this first one, devices to manage, this is really just around the what that simplified management console provides. Intune for Education still includes the rights for users to have iOS devices, Mac OS devices, Android devices, all up. You can have a user have up to 15 devices, so that's kind of a pretty generous allowance. But it takes into account if someone's got a laptop, a tablet, a phone, etc., that they need managed. It makes it a lot easier to go through and do that. Now, once we start getting to the additional ticks or the additional checkboxes that we've got on the right-hand side, you'll see here that these are those Azure AD premium features that start adding additional capabilities to Intune that Intune standalone doesn't offer, but Intune for Education does offer. So some of the things that are included to make it easier, so if you do work with school environments, being able to run through the express setup process where you just supply the information that it's asking for. So if you want to set up something like school data sync, so this is something that's been available with Office 365, but it also works with Intune because they're both based on Azure Active Directory for identity. So importing things like the student list, the class lists, the teacher lists, and being able to map things out into the appropriate groups. So that's where we can then go through, we can choose the groups that we want settings to apply to, what apps we want to apply to them. So do we want to roll out the Office 365 Pro apps, for example? Do we want to push out web apps? Do we want to push out Windows Store apps? These are things that we can do very easily through this console. Then we can go through and choose the settings that we want to apply, and this way we can go through and start putting restrictions in place so that the devices work as expected for an educational environment. And then once we've done that, then we can just basically go through and say we'll apply these, and effectively now we start getting cloud-based delivery of these settings. So from there, it's pretty easy. We can either say I'm done, or if we've got more groups that we need to start configuring, then we can create more groups from there. So once we've gone through and we've created those groups, what do we do next? Well, this is where we can go through and just get users to sign in using their credentials. And on the Windows devices, doing an Azure AD join means that they'll get apps deployed and installed automatically. Those apps will be managed centrally. Their identity will be managed centrally, and you'll be able to start collecting hardware data and information on have these apps been deployed successfully? Is there anyone who doesn't have them? And you can get all of that information very, very easily. So once we've got that in place, effectively we now start looking at having zero-touch management of those Windows 10 devices. So the ability to push out web apps, the Windows Store apps, Win32 apps as MSIs, we can do all of that quite easily. And this is something where, because it's an online service, we don't need to worry about maintaining on-prem infrastructure. Instead, we just focus on what are the solutions that are going to provide the best value for the organization. So whatever it is that's applicable for that user based on the groups that they're members of, they'll start getting those settings and those pieces of software deployed as required. And they also follow the user from device to device because it's based on the user identity rather than just being based on the device itself. So some of the enhancements then when it comes to the shared device management is being able to go through and start having simplified wallpaper deployment, customizing the start menu using the XML files, choosing what apps get installed, as well as the policies that we choose to apply. And then also for organizations that want to take advantage of the take a test capabilities, so we can go through and start locking PCs down when they hit certain URLs. So if a class does need to run tests, for example, not necessarily NAPLAN, but if you think of those types of things where people go, well, we need to go to a dedicated location, well, NAPLAN may actually be a great example of that, depending on the school that you're at. Now, just to give an idea of one of the things they've done with Intune is with Intune for Education is they've drastically simplified the Intune console. So they're just presenting a subset of what Intune can do, just focused on Windows 10 capabilities. But as I said, if you need the full functionality that's underneath this console, you can jump into the regular Intune portal and do everything you want across Windows devices, across iOS devices, Mac devices, iOS devices, no problem whatsoever. Now, We'll talk about this in just a moment, but I mentioned already that we've got integration with the Windows Store for Business. So remember, as I said with the Windows 10s story, that Windows Store for Business is becoming more and more important to Microsoft. So Microsoft's working very closely, not just with internal teams at Microsoft, but with third-party software developers to really make sure they can accelerate their move to the Windows Store, even if it means just taking their existing apps and repackaging them. Now, with School Data Sync, this is how we can easily go through and start synchronizing from CSV files or connecting into a service to pull in the updated student list, for example. And that's been available since the beginning of the year. So just to sort of start summing up some of those different management options that we covered, well, if we take a look here for a simpler environment, so here it could be a really small business or or a school, as we saw here, we may just rely completely on cloud-based management for these solutions and not worry too much about, well, should we put in server infrastructure to manage these? On the other side of the coin, though, we'll have organizations that do have a dependency on group policy. They need group policy, but they still want to start leveraging some cloud technology. So using Azure Active Directory Connect, maybe for larger organizations, things like ADFS or AAD Connect with pass-through authentication, starting to then leverage Azure Active Directory, Intune, single sign-on into Office 365, for example, depending on what their organization requirements are. So just a quick wrap up then on Intune for Education is that it is Intune with additional capabilities. So we do get that simplified console for managing Windows 10 devices, so that for staff that aren't necessarily incredibly tech, they can still go through and use that simplified console in a pretty easy and pretty efficient manner. So let's just talk about the Windows Store for Business, which has also got an education equivalent, the Windows Store for Education. So with the Store for Business, this is where Microsoft says, look, you can sign in using your corporate credentials, so basically your Azure Active Directory credentials, to start highlighting what are the apps that you want to make available through the private store, or that you want your MDM solution, so your mobile device management solution, to actually start managing and distributing out. And obviously things like Intune and Intune for Education will do that for you, but in this case it's something that you can also use standalone, so that if you decide that you need to get those Office mobile apps, or if you need to get Flow or Power BI, etc. from the Windows Store out to users easily, it's very easy for you to go through to, it's effectively like businessstore.microsoft.com, you sign in, and you can start assigning and deploying the apps as needed. Now, just to sort of give an idea here, again, going back to the education conversation, is there are a lot of education-focused apps in there, and if you are signing in from an account that's associated with an Office 365 education tenant, you'll start seeing education-specific categories in there. Now, it's not a different store, it just puts a different view on the store if you are coming in from an EDU account. So in this case, the categories that it's got there for maths, for languages, etc., these are things that, once you are signed in with an education account, they'll appear pretty quickly. Now, another school-related one before we go on to wrap up with a few things non-school specific. But we could go through here and take a look at, we could manually go through and, configure devices, getting them to join, etc. Alternatively, what we can do is we can start running through and run the Setup School PCs app. So with that bottom option, you'll see that there's a USB flash drive. Now, we don't necessarily have to use the flash drive. We could point to a network share. But one of the things that using the flash drive means is that as the machine is starting up for the first time, instead of us going through and spending a lot of time configuring the machine and then enrolling it in the management solution, we could just go through and use that flash drive, insert it during the machine startup, and then tell it to, it will see those files, and we'll see that on the next few screens. But it allows the devices to be enrolled without having to require credentials per device as you're doing that setup, and it will automatically install the apps and apply those settings when the teacher or the student signs in. So it basically is dynamically pulling down the settings that are required. So when we take a look at the Setting Up School PCs app, it's just really a matter of we can set this up using flash drives. So if it's a small number of PCs, just creating a couple of flash drives might be easier. But if you're trying to scale it up, then maybe, looking at should we do it over a network share, that could potentially make a little bit more sense. But again, there are different ways and different choices that we've got here. Now this is an app that you can grab from the Windows Store, so anyone can grab this and take a look at it to see what it does. And one of the things that's been added in this is the Azure AD join capabilities. So what do we get when we use this set up the student PC app? Well, we could put tiles on the start menu, we can set Edge as the default browser, we can uninstall apps that were pre-installed by the OEM. We can block Microsoft accounts from being used because now we can just use our organizational accounts or school accounts to get access to Windows Store, for example. We get better sign-in performance, we get account management capabilities, and because there are some optimizations included to make sure that regardless of how many users are alternating use of the device, that it still keeps performance running at a good pace. Now this is a screenshot, so behind the scenes here you can see that it's running the Windows out-of-box experience, but when we plug in a flash drive it says, well, do you want to set up a device? And I say yes, and then at that point it will go through, apply the settings, and then we restart it and it's ready for that first user to sign on to the device. Now that Setup School PCs app is a subset of the Windows Configuration Designer. So with the Windows Configuration Designer, we've got the ability to go through and really dig behind the scenes, and so there are some simple options we get with the Setup School PCs app, but in some cases you may want something a little bit easier, a little bit more configurable to really customize it to do it the way you want it. And that's what we can do here. We can build out provisioning packages here. We can still do the Azure AD join. We could do on-prem AD join, for example. We can take the packages that we've created and we can script them using PowerShell. So we can use them in MDT, we can use them in SCCM, and we can go through and then start pulling, again, start using things like Windows Store, etc., as that distribution point. So that brings me to the end of this month's recording. So just to wrap up with a few resources that we've got available. So we've got the Microsoft Australia OEM team blog site. So that's up at blogs.technet.com/Oz OEM team. And this is information focused on OEM and system builder reseller partners and people focused on selling devices into SMB. So the device seller focus is an important part of this. So the focus there is on Windows and Windows Server, but obviously now with some of the tighter links into things like Azure Active Directory and Office 365, you'll see that we've started to include some information on some of those technologies as well. For those of you who do have pre-sale support questions, don't forget you can always reach out to us at oemserverau@microsoft.com. And for the latest information and assets around helping to grow your business, with a technology focus on Windows 10, Server, Office, and Microsoft devices, take a look at microsoftsmarthq.com.au. So that